fundamentally, I do enjoy the process. Like I write on my blog a lot, and I always have. I'm sure, like you, I have a huge list of things I always want to investigate. And for me, like writing about them is how I do a proper investigation.
How long did it take you to write the book?
I'd say the first draft was about like 9 months, I think, to a year. And then surprisingly, I thought it would be much faster, but that period from when the first draft was done to when actually it went through all the technical editing and then later the layout and that sort of thing and the additional edits, that was actually almost a whole nother year, which is really wild.
In terms of consulting, are most of your engagements with Rails and Postgres specifically, or is it even like Postgres more broadly for things like that?
Yeah, well, I've just started to sign some client work up that is outside of Rails. Like they're not using Ruby on Rails at all, and but they're using Postgres. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I want to get to.
I feel like there's this giant ecosystem of extensions. What do you think of that whole ecosystem we're seeing there? Hey, folks, this is Alex. Got another great Postgres episode for you today. Got Andrew Atkinson on, who just released high performance Postgres for Rails. He's great. I think he's super useful if you're like building in some sort of application framework using Postgres a lot and just want to know more about performance optimization and scaling and operational stuff, all those sorts of things. He calls himself accidental DBA or an application DBA. And I just think it's really fascinating, right? So we talked through a lot of just like different Postgres features, what you should be using, what you shouldn't be using, performance tips, all sorts of things like that. Really great. Hey, check out the book. I bought the book. It's awesome. It just came out. It's really great if you're sort of in that world. So as always, if you have any comments, suggestions, questions, feel free to hit up me or Sean. If you have any guests that you want on, feel free to reach out. And with that, let's get to the show. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I'm excited to have you on, kind of continuing our Postgres series here. And you are the author of High Performance Postgres for Rails, which is printing as we speak. By the time this episode is released, it'll be available, probably next day shipping or 2-day shipping from Amazon, whatever. So get that if you want it. But you do some Postgres consulting, but maybe for everyone else here, give us a little bit of background on who you are and what you're up to.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, I've been a Ruby on Rails web application developer for more than a decade, and have done some other things as well with within web applications like other languages and frameworks. I also did some mobile development, but the last kind of handful of years, I've been more of a backend developer, and then I've been, really enamored with Postgres for a number of years, having the chance to use it at higher scale, running into a lot of common issues, and I decided at some point to sort of specialize in that within the backend engineering realm, and specifically for web applications, and just kind of understanding how to maximize our use of Postgres. And now I'm doing that as a consultant for companies that want to hire me to help them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me more about like the origin there and like how did you get into did you raise your hand when it came up like of hey, database issues are sort of our problem here at the company right now, or how did you get into the deeper Postgres stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely a little hand raising. It was having opportunities, of course, like that, I guess, preceded the hand raising. It was kind of like trying to look at challenges as opportunities, technically, but also to be helpful on the team and sort of complement a team that, sort of where I cut my teeth mainly was a small team, and not everyone on the team could do everything. So I was sort of like, well, I'd love to actually help more in terms of our scalability at the time, one of the past teams I was on, with the database operations in particular. And it sort of scratched my personal itch on, learning to read query plans, learning to design indexes and that sort of thing. But then it was immediately useful and helpful for the team. So that was a big part of it. And then I think also just like philosophically, as I've worked at, there's things that sort of line up with my kind of perspective in life, and that happen to be how databases work too. Like they sort of hold the company's most valuable asset in data. And I like the idea of working close to that. But then there's this interesting challenge too, where as an application scales, you also need to have great performance to hand the data back out to clients, to client applications. And that's really an interesting challenge to both make sure that it's, consistent and preserved properly, backups and all that, but also can be served back. And so I just think it's really interesting. It's really practical. Every company I've worked at faces these challenges. And so, yeah, I just sort of felt like, I really want to do this better as an engineer. And what do I need to do to get there?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I empathize with that. I have like a similar road, background stuff, but just got more and more interested into the database stuff because I think it is really fascinating. Like the backend stuff gets a little repetitive after a while, but the database stuff I think is just like so fascinating, like how many different areas there are. And it sort of like makes sense logically, but you just need to like, understand all these different pieces and then think how they go together. And I liked how you called it on a different podcast, like the accidental DBA or like an application DBA of like, hey, you sort of accidentally fell into it and now you're sort of the person, but you're still like very application focused as well, right? Like you're a DBA, but you're not just like, ivory tower, like sitting in the in the back office, like writing the queries and all that stuff. You're like doing it in the context of shipping some stuff and understanding user needs and things like that, which I think is great.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Like, I learned that term from Charity Majors, the accidental DBA term. And then I also learned this term from Hockey Benita, application DBA. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me, both of those things where it's like, yeah, you can kind of accidentally fumble your way into this from real needs from an application that's scaling and needs to write and, retrieve data quickly. And then you also can say, I really like working with this part of the tech stack, happens to be a database. Maybe you don't tend to do so much like, security and backups and restores and stuff, but certainly the applications usages of the of the database, like mostly around indexes and schema design and data modeling and that sort of thing. Like that's critically important for the success of the growth and performance of the application as well.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on the book, I want to say like the book is great. I got the early access version and went through it. I think it's great. I want to talk about it more, but like I thought like it was useful for lots of different types of people, and I would say like three ways. Like, hey, if you're like where you were maybe 7-8 years ago, where I was like 5-6 years ago, and it's like, hey, you're starting to get interested in the database and want to know more about how that works. Just reading it straight through is just great, right? Because it has this like sample application and you're like actually running these commands and understanding these concepts, but like applying them well. I think that's super useful. Number one. I think there's like a second group where it's like, hey, if you're having operational stuff or scaling stuff, you see that on the future and you want to know some of the patterns for thinking about that better. I think that's like a great reference material for that. And then just like, if you're having specific performance issues, man, Appendix 1, I think it's Appendix 1. It's just like this amazing resource to like point you in the right direction. It's like, hey, if you're having slow queries, go read like these 4 chapters, right? If you're having like high write latency or you're having invalid data, right, because your schema is not tight enough, like go read these specific chapters. Like I thought that was super useful as just like, I'm drowning right now and I need something to help me out. I don't have time to read through the entire thing today, but like if I could just like fix that problem, that'd be great as well. So I think like on all those things, it's really a great book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great to hear. And the field, we called it the field guide at the end, the Appendix 1 that you're mentioning. That was actually like a late edition, and it was based on some reader feedback that was like, hey, what if I don't really want to read the book front to back, which I get. I mean, a lot of tech books, like it's, so they were like, what if I have specific issues I want to dive into? And that made so much sense to me. And I was like, why did we not do this earlier? Like, but yeah, I mean, a lot of course, like a lot of, manuals and things you pick up they have like a troubleshooting guide. And yeah, it's great if it gets more people into the book that way, even if they don't read the whole book, like, but they can get some value out of starting from a specific issue. That would be a great outcome.
Yep. And the one thing I would say too is like this book is high performance Postgres for Rails. I have never written Rails in my life. I've written like 10 lines of Ruby in like some chef scripts once that I inherited for someone, and that's it. And it was still like super useful. It's not like super Rails heavy to where it's not going to be useful to anybody else. So if you're like an application dev, you want to be an application DBA, it's somewhere in that realm, like definitely check it out. Like in terms of consulting, are most of your engagements with Rails and Postgres specifically, or is it even like Postgres more broadly for things like that?
Yeah, well, I've just started to sign some client work up that is outside of Rails. Like they're not using Ruby on Rails at all, and but they're using Postgres. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I want to get to. And I guess like both in writing the book and then in launching consulting, which I've really just been doing now for not quite 6 months. I just felt like Ruby on Rails is my homeland, so to speak. Like it's what I know, so I would start there. But I do think that a web application, especially if it's a MVC type of if there's an MVC type of framework with an ORM, like whether it's PHP and Laravel or Django or it's Node and Prisma or that sort of thing, like I'm sure that there's going to be some of the same problematic query patterns because of this kind of object relational sometimes mismatch and that sort of thing. And so I do think I could help teams out that use Postgres, that use other web application frameworks. And I'd be happy to do that, of course. And I both on the database side and then also, if needed, hopping into the code base and that sort of thing.
Yep, sure. For most of these engagements, what are the developers like, and what's the relationship with the database like? Are they like curious but just need a guide? Are they like indifferent and just like, hey, somebody come fix this for me? Like, where are they sort of at with that?
Yeah, I've worked with teams that have, somewhat to some extent, I get it. Like I've also been on the other side and have hired. I was part of a team at a past company where I was an employee, a full-time employee, and we hired a database person outside to come in and take a look at our stuff and help us out and whatnot. And they had sort of a narrow, insulated perspective into the company. And I think, like practically speaking, that is usually how I start with a company. Is like I do have somewhat of a narrow perspective, so I don't necessarily know a lot about the dev team beyond people I'm meeting one-on-one or might be part of a kickoff or that sort of thing. But I certainly have had, it's been very fulfilling to have sometimes, like I recently started helping out a company where someone told me right away, they're like, oh, hey, I bought your book and I'm a big fan of some of your stuff. And I'm really excited that you're here. They weren't the person like they weren't the person that directly hired me, but they were part of the team. And I felt very good. Like this is going to be a positive engagement for all of us, right? Like this person's kind of primed to want to learn more. Like they have, they have observability in place. They have some query issues. They have some indexes on their tables, but they're still slow queries. They're not sure why. They're wondering about different schema designs. Like should they add their tenant identifier column everywhere? Like, different things that can lend themselves to opening up improved performance. And so I think like in those are great. I think I also though have been hired where on some teams where they're pretty good, and I think they're sort of just looking for in terms of their skills and their experience. And I try to call that out right away. Like in some cases, like one client, like I didn't really actually after a bit of time, like I didn't really think I was super needed by them. And I think that's fine too. Like there could be I know another consultant I follow kind of mentioned like the project that he was on arrived at a natural conclusion, like because he was helping out with performance. Performance was generally improved. It's not, there will be ongoing opportunities. However, if you make a big improvement for a company, like it might sort of just reach a conclusion. So yeah, I'd say I have kind of a spectrum of experiences there.
Yep, absolutely. Do you have any like common mistakes that you see kind of over and over? Is it the same couple things, or is it pretty wide variety?
Yeah, I guess like a few things would just be over indexing. I know we have this field in a where clause in a SQL query somewhere, so I added an index on it, but it's not used at all by any queries. Under indexing, like these queries are slow. We've got 2 indexes on the table, but it might actually benefit from having around 10 based on the queries that how the table's accessed, how the row data is accessed. Never tuning any parameters, which I think isn't the very first thing you should do in my experience, but I think having awareness of what the tunable parameters are, there's about a dozen or so that are in my kind of core list that I would recommend. Never archiving any data or really talking about any kind of data retention policy. I think it's hard because you got to usually have like a product discussion with kind of sometimes with a lot of stakeholders about like, changing a system that has access to data forever, but it's years and years old, and there's years and years of data that's never actually accessed, but it could be. And having that conversation, I'd say those are some of the patterns that come to mind.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Let's dive in. I want to dive in. I like a bunch of questions, but these are all some good ones. So you mentioned over indexing. And so if I have too many indexes, is that mostly going to show up with just worse write performance because it's hitting all these different indexes?
Yeah, it's right performance, but I actually think it's more about it's a little bit of a symptom of you're not really able to tell that your indexes are not being used, you know? And the and if it's unlikely that sometimes I think folks think that they might be adding a benefit to having an index that could be used, but it's if a certain amount of time has passed and the application is pretty well stabilized, and I'm not talking about a situation where you're like in a rapid scaling period, but if you have a pretty stable application that's mature, likely a B2B kind of SaaS app, and you added an index years ago that's never been used, like I think it's very unlikely it's ever going to be used. And and I think sometimes there's a little bit of a mindset shift in this actually is worsening write performance a bit, but it is providing like no value. And the other thing that can happen is for heavily updated tables is there can be very high bloat in indexes, and they can grow, and it's not uncommon, and it can be very surprising to people that indexes can actually exceed the size of the table if they're never rebuilt. And so what can happen is, besides the write performance, which is an ongoing concern, as you start to do, like you create backups of your database and you want to restore those for test environments, or if you start to become more concerned about your ability to restore from a backup and how long that might take, those are things where you have this unused index that is possibly very bloated and very heavy in terms of how much space it's consuming. Like let's get rid of it. And I'm talking about, like, for clients I've met with, it's not uncommon to have dozens or even hundreds of unused indexes.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
If they've got a database with 500 indexes, it's not uncommon to have 200 that are unused. And usually it speaks to just more of like, we're just kind of spraying and praying indexes here, and we don't really have the observability or the skills to know that they're not being used.
Yeah. Yeah. You sort of mentioned like, hey, if you've had an index around and haven't written to it, it's probably, in the last couple of years, it's probably, or haven't used it in the last couple of years, it's probably fine to drop it. Do you ever do you recommend having sort of currently unused, but potentially used in the future for some feature index? Or are you just like, hey, let's create that index once we specifically know we need it? Or is that like too expensive an operation to do even concurrently, that you'd rather like sort of build it early on and keep it updated up front?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on all the points, really. I mean, I think that it's it's tricky to answer, because I'd say I have like my really quick answer and then my like Cadillac, deluxe answer. My really quick answer is, if I'd say, just if you're really concerned that the index may be useful and be used by queries, but you're not yet able to determine that concretely, and you don't currently have a use case for it, but maybe you have a feature in development that you expect it will be useful, and it's a big table. I mean, you can keep the index. What I would try to do is get the observability in place that will show that it's unused, and then on an ongoing basis that it's unused, even after your feature launches. That's my like attempt at a short answer. My Cadillac answer, though, is it's more of a holistic problem. We want to get like better observability in place that shows all of our indexes that are used and the ones that are unused. And then we want to like develop kind of a hygiene approach where it's like we're always kind of removing usually the unused indexes is kind of a big one-time change. But then if we have the monitoring in place, then as application code changes and evolves over time, we also can do a periodic maintenance kind of check and make sure we don't have a lot of unused indexes.
Yep. For monitoring unused indexes and things like that, is that like, a script I'm running every once in a while? Is that PG Hero or something like that? Or like, how are you monitoring those unused indexes?
Yeah, there's you can DIY it, and you can certainly check within the Postgres system catalogs when indexes are scanned. That information is tracked, so you can check periodically and even capture that data you want. If you want to store your own scan data, you could say, go through all my indexes now, check their scan counts, and then what you could do is you can build a metric or a timeline view as to a particular index or set of indexes that haven't been scanned over a particular set of time. And you can do that both on your primary instance and any replicas that you have. And then tools like PG Hero is an open source tool that does some of that for you. So it essentially comes with a bunch of those queries baked into it that are checking against your system catalogs. Or another tool that I've used with a couple clients that I'm a big fan of, it is a commercial tool though, is PG Analyze. And PG Analyze you set up an agent and it will consume your log files. It'll perform some of those types of queries, and it'll actually turn that into sort of like work units. And it will say, here's an unused index, and it's actually an alert. And then you can have a little bit of workflow around that and that kind of thing. So I'd say, but of course that tool is going to cost money on a monthly basis. So it makes sense for companies that are heavily using Postgres and looking to squeeze as much as they can from it. But if you're just kind of getting started, I think running those queries by hand is perfectly reasonable.
Yep. Okay. You mentioned rebuilding indexes. Is this similar to vacuum? Is it contained within a vacuum? How does like sort of rebuild and vacuum, how do those work together?
Yeah, it's similar to vacuum in that the idea is to efficiently store your physical row data, or to store it physically efficiently. So what are like logical rows in a table? You want those to be stored physically as efficiently as possible without gaps and that sort of thing, which vacuum doesn't do, but it makes space available for reuse. Vacuum without any additional commands. There is a vacuum full command that will actually rewrite your table, and that would be the closest corollary. But we'll talk about why it's not easy to do. But vacuum full would be the closest to a reindex operation on your index, in that it's going to rebuild your index, and any references, any index entries that would have pointed to row versions that no longer exist or are reachable, those are going to be gone, because it's just going to rebuild your index from the current point in time. And it's pretty, if you have a table, like it is, like it's always worth mentioning to people, because first, what I recommend is you get rid of all of your unused indexes. But then I do recommend that if you have a database that's been around for a number of years, and you have tables that especially are heavily updated, or there's frequent batch deletions from them, to go and take a look at your indexes. And you can also check out, we've got queries in the book, and you can find these easily online, that help determine the kind of bloat percentage, or the estimated percentage of your indexes, how much of them are non-useful content, basically. And it's pretty wild how sometimes they can actually be like cut in half in terms of size. And then that helps both with space consumption and access to the indexes. You're just accessing what you need from the index more efficiently.
Yep. Cool. Okay. We dove right into the deep stuff right away based on some of the consulting. So I'm going to go back to like some warm up questions I had. So one tip you had in the book was around, hey, single column indexes. And you said like, hey, single column indexes often is the right choice to just use like, hey, just index that one column. For me, like my Dynamo brain, I always think of like partition key and then sorting. So I think of that. So it was weird not to have like, hey, some sort parameter on that. I guess like, is that single column advice mostly for if you are getting just a single row at a time, like maybe getting a user with this particular email address? Or does that also apply when I have some sorting in there? And I'm thinking like, hey, an e-commerce store where they want to get the orders for a customer, right? And so like I'm indexing on that customer ID, but in that case, should I be using a multi-column with like a sort on the created ad or something like date?
Yeah, you're thinking about it in the right way. And I think like it's like what I found is I start to develop a nose for, sort of like what a good candidate multi-column index would be, like based on a query or a situation where it's not going to be so beneficial. Like a single column index will provide the same value, maybe because there's a lot more columns that need to be scanned or that sort of thing, or maybe there isn't an ordering in the query or that kind of thing. And so there's going to be that second heap fetch phase after the index scan that's going to go and get all the other column data that we need. But yeah, I mean, for single columns, if you have an order by operation, it's possible that you are and a filter. Like if you're filtering on all the rows with a date greater than a certain value, and your query is ordering by that, a single column index on that column might work out great. And you can even control the column direction in the index too. So if you're, sorting by order by descending, you can set your index entries up that way as well in your index definition. But if you do have like a where clause that is filtering by an attribute on the table, and then you have an order by for a second attribute, that could be a good spot to have your leading column be your filter column and your second column be your ordering column. And the what I try to help clients do, and what I always do myself, is try to get as close to production in terms of row counts and instance resources that I can, if I'm not able to kind of validate a design on production, which you can do, but like most companies don't want to do that. But if we can get like a pre-prod Postgres instance, then if we can get the SQL query with representative params, then we can actually just try both indexes and run the explain plan and see what Postgres likes better.
Yep. On that same note, okay, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. But how do you think about performance testing and things like that with a relational database when there are just so many factors? Like you're saying, you can replicate the row counts and things like that, but replicating the concurrent queries that are going on against it, maybe even like the bloat stuff, depending on how
bloat
much
is thing.
Like how do you do sort of accurate performance testing, or do you is it a lot of looking at the query plan and understanding that, or how do you think about some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, it is really, really hard. I don't think there is a great solution to have a high, really super 100% high fidelity pre-production performance testing environment. So I think like with databases, it's helpful, or with like Postgres anyways, it's helpful to know the kinds of things that influence outcomes and then basically kind of zero in on those. Like a lot of times what I look at is the the cardinality of a column, like the unique set of values, and then how selective a query might be and how selective an index definition might be. And there's this kind of rule of thumb that I always kind of kick around in my head. I heard from somebody. This is just like not a low, not a very sophisticated rule of thumb, but it's like generally when we access a table, even if we have not the same sort of row counts, but depending on, we do generally want to have similar row counts, but I tend to think of this 30% figure as a proportion of what we're trying to access and what the total row count is for the table. So if we're trying to access something that's like 30% or less, it's likely the query planner is going to choose an index scan over scanning the whole table. And in terms of performance problems, I mean, commonly the main problem is indexes that we're hoping are used, or we're not able to design a good index, are not being used. And so the full table is being read. And, that's where we might start from. And if we can even if we don't have a perfect fidelity pre-prod environment to test in, but we know that the problem is in production, that the full table is being read and then it's filtered down to 5 rows or something from millions, then as long as we can simulate that as a starting point, and we can get an index that is matches kind of like a narrow set, then what we can do is be pretty confident that if we can recreate the slow query in the pre-production environment, like i.e. the full table scan, and then we can design either sometimes through a combination of query changes, but a highly targeted index using tactics like multi-column indexes, partial indexes, indexes on expressions, different tactics that could be very specialized for a particular query. But like as long as we validate that query is then used and lessening the cost of that in the pre-prod environment, then usually it's like almost always the case, like let's add the index in prod and the problem goes away. But we can also of course add the index in production and be super confident that the plan is going to be set. And then of course we want to have observability too that tracks what the query plans were for a query over time, which we can talk about as well.
Yep. If I'm adding a index in production and doing it concurrently, is that going to take up a lot of resource? Like if it's a big table, is it going to take up a lot of resources, or is it just going to use a smaller amount of resources and just take longer? Or like how worried should I be about adding a new index to a decent sized table?
Yeah, there are some caps in there. Like you'll have, you can only do one per table concurrently. I think if you start a second one from another session, it'll get canceled. I haven't tried it lately, but you can only do one. And then you have maintenance work memory is one of the Postgres parameters that will control um, uh, memory for maintenance operations. I believe that is maintenance that's used for, or that memory allocation is used for create index concurrently. But I, I tend to actually see it elsewhere, like for vacuum operations and that sort of thing. So I'm not 100% on that. I might be wrong about that. But generally, no, I mean, that is what we need to do for big tables. Like, for example, I've got a client with a 600 million row table. It can take like a couple hours to build an index. So we might set up a session like with Screen or Tmux and manually kick off a create index concurrently in the background, sort of monitor things. There's going to, of course, be IO and CPU that's going to be used during that period.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's talk about schemas a little bit and just basically how strict should I make my schema is the overarching view here. But some specific questions like, should I allow nulls on my columns, or should I try to avoid that? As I mean, obviously sometimes you need them, but like, how do you think about nulls?
Well, yeah, I mean, I generally try to default to being restrictive, I guess. I mean, I think that's like the DBA mindset is
Yeah.
as many restrictions as possible, because restrictions breed better performance typically, and actually sometimes more information about your data and sometimes better quality data and that sort of thing. But it's all about, I guess, what the application needs. If nulls are allowed, and that's important to the application's goals, then from a read perspective, then that's a good spot to think about partial indexes where we could, if we don't need to, like if maybe it's information we don't yet have, but we want to capture a row, but that particular field is not set yet. If we're not querying on that, then we could exclude those using a partial index and say, give me all the rows, but where this value is not null.
Yep, absolutely. What about foreign key references? Should I always use those?
Yeah, I think this is funny, I guess, because it seems like for some people it seems like it's controversial that foreign keys are onerous, and there's certainly people recommending not using them. I mean, typically what I see is I'm an advocate of foreign keys. I think they should be used. I think if you truly are experiencing, if you have the type of scale where you're moving beyond one instance and you can't use them, or if you can, or if you have the type of scale where you're concerned about the impact of the foreign key constraint enforcement, and you've done the things like add indexes to foreign key columns and that sort of thing, or make sure that cascading deletes are supported by indexes. And like, you probably also are at the level of sophistication where you know how to monitor their impact and what the benefit is in removing them. But I think most people that I've worked with, like, they're not there. It's more like there's maybe some fear, uncertainty, and doubt around using them. And so what I try to do is encourage the use of foreign key constraints, check constraints, with the emphasis being on having the best quality data that you can get at the front end, helping describe your data for other use cases like data analysts that want to use it later from your relational database. And they're working in, BigQuery or Redshift or somewhere else. And they're like, this data is a mess. Like, we're sort of like setting ourselves up for success if we have good quality data on the front side. So yeah, I generally recommend them.
Yep. What you mentioned, cascade deletes and things like that. Is that something I should be worried about? The downstream impacts of deleting some top level items and then just like deletes 12,000 items elsewhere, or is that overblown as an issue?
Well, I guess like it is something that should be on your radar if you do take advantage of cascading deletes. I mean, it can catch people off guard that deletes can be a somewhat expensive operation in Postgres on big tables. If you're deleting large ranges of values, because of the multi-version concurrency control, there'll be a new row version that's created. So your old row version needs to be cleaned up, and that can create the fragmentation or the bloat problem and that sort of thing. And if you do have, like you said, if you touch a bunch of tables and yeah, like it's a situation where you want to know how to look at the queries that will be generated and use the look at an explain plan and make sure that they're going to be, when they're accessed via the cascading deletes, that's going to be an index supported query if it's a big table. So yeah, it's not like, I think if you're dealing with tables like in the sub 1 million to 10 million row range, and you got a few that's doing cascade deletes on a reasonably sized modern instance, you're probably fine. But I think if you get into if you're doing big delete jobs on 100 plus million row tables, it should be on your radar as something to be aware of.
Yep. Yep. What about check constraints? How often do you use those? Do you use them for like all kinds of application level validation, or do you say like, hey, Rails can handle a lot of that? Yeah. How often do you use check constraints?
Yeah, I would say that, as I've learned more about Postgres over the last few years, like it's something that I'm trying to advocate for more usage of, because I'd say in my real world experience, I don't really see a lot of usage of them. And, like I first learned about them more as like a intermediary use case with where you want to introduce a constraint that doesn't let you add it only for new row changes. And you can do that with check constraints. So you can use check constraints kind of as a transitional element, which is cool. But you can also use check constraints as a data quality check mechanism by writing a rule that kind of describes what you expect. And so as a fan of them, I kind of think they should be everywhere on all the tables, like anywhere you have an application rule. Like, why not throw a database level check constraint in, as long as you're capturing those what will be Postgres errors when they violate the constraint, as long as you're capturing that in the application and handling that gracefully, which is, does take some work. I think they're a great tool.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I've sort of, have you heard of Tiger Beetle in that database?
Just very recently, but I don't really know anything about it.
Okay. Yeah. I would say like they're unique in a lot of ways. And one of their thing, like, they have this thing called Tiger style about how they write code and things like that. And one of the things they do is they use asserts very heavily in their code. Like they're like asserting all these conditions, and this is actually in their application code. But it sort of makes me like think about that with Postgres too, where it's just like, why wouldn't you just sort of validate that, I think you have an example in the book of like, hey, the ride completed at is after when the ride started at, right? So you just don't have some wonky data that way and things like, it's like, why wouldn't you just make sure your data doesn't get in a bad state in some of those different ways, even if you have the application level checks, just making sure elsewhere. So I've come around on like, hey, more asserts, more checks, more just ways to like validate that you're not putting garbage into your database and causing a problem later.
Yeah, and I think thanks for bringing that example up, because it's an interesting one, because it's I think that like for newer folks that don't think about data quality as much, or maybe haven't really been burned by that as much in their career experience, it might be a little odd. It's like, well, of course, like, can't we expect that? But like, it's a little wild when you think about how it's like, no, you can't expect anything. Like, you don't know what kind of data you're going to get on the front end from the application, right? And sometimes it's not like it's malicious, it's just errors, and that sort of thing with like forms or just human data entry, whether it's even outside your company or inside your company. And so it's almost like sending a message in a bottle to the future. To me, it's like, here's what we expect. And I do think, like, if those tools are there, it might not make sense to add them all right away, because maybe it is a little heavy handed. But if you start to see some issues, like, oh, we got our timestamps out of order, like they're nonsensical. It's like, well, let's fix it once and then let's put the check constraint in so it never happens again. That's kind of my mindset.
Yep. 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 Okay. Another feature that's kind of interesting, and I think you see mixed opinions on it, are like functions and triggers, right? Where like stored procedures kind of pretty out of favor for a while. When should I use functions and triggers? How should I avoid them?
Yeah, it's hard to provide generic evidence or advice on this, I guess, to be frank, because, yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes what I tend to experience is if I'm bringing more database awareness of different capabilities, I'm probably not going to go with functions and triggers first. It's more just even like check constraints or something like that, that's a little bit softer. If you're already a team that's, using check constraints and has a nice schema design and has good performance and can read explain plans and stuff, then I think like that might be the circumstances for saying, okay, well, do we have some background jobs that are client code? Like maybe it's written in a programming language, it's called from cron, that's like doing a lot of back and forth between the client and maybe doing some processing on the client and then making another call to Postgres, doing some processing, writing files out. Like it might be interesting to think about like, well, what if we did this as a procedure, as transactional control? It's relatively simple. It's like bulk updating some rows or refreshing a materialized view, or I don't know, doing something that's relatively simple, but being able to save kind of the client round trips. And then in the book, like we looked at how you can still manage that as source code in a sense. There's a couple open source tools that like allow you to write, just like you might write a method in Ruby or another programming language, like put your function into version control. You can version it. You can have PRs. You can treat it like first class code. And I think if you can show a benefit to like the execution time for that approach over an application code approach, like it makes sense to me. Like, why not? I didn't really get into this in the book, but there's even like some unit testing capabilities, PG tap, for example, in Postgres, where if you want to write some kind of like branching logic unit tests, you can do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. You mentioned explain plans a few times. Like, what's the best way to I could never parse the darn things. So like, what's the best way to learn how to, make sense of what's going on there?
Yeah, they're super dense and complex. It's really cool that databases are a bit weird. Where you have this declarative model and it's a runtime decision. Like what's going to happen with your query is like Post is going to choose that runtime, and so like the best we can do is basically say like what are you planning to do Postgres with this query? Using explain, and then what I've recommended to people is like I've shared my experience, which is that, for me, it's taken a long time to learn bits of a plan, like learning it sort of not necessarily trying to learn everything right away, but, the basics, like, is my index used, so making sure I can see where it's mentioned in the explain plan. And then the plan is composed of plan nodes. And then it's kind of like, depending on how much time and interest you have and how important the query is, you can just go deep on more plan nodes. So understanding what a bitmap heap scan and bitmap index scan are and how that's different from an index scan or a sequential scan. If you have a need to understand that, there's some great resources out there. Like the Postgres docs are a bit challenging there when you're getting started, but like I'm a big fan of PG Mustard, which is a explain plan visualization tool. It is a commercial tool, but they do have a free glossary that they maintain with a lot of great terms. And then their kind of help information is kind of a public service too, I think, where they'll describe what a bitmap heap scan is, for example, and a little bit of information about like when you might see that and what you might want to do with that. And so, yeah, I think like, and then the other thing too is I'm not beyond admitting that. I mean, I use ChatGPT a ton for like,
yeah.
I mean, like if it's like, if I have a specific targeted question, it's an amazing tool that we have available now where I can say like, I'm getting a bitmap heap scan. I'm filtering, like I'm accessing this many rows. The column is this type. Like, how can I access this? You can, the more you know about how to read explain plans, the better prompt you can supply. And it's not like typically it's kind of my research assistant, like I'll like get some ideas, jot them down, design a little experiment, play around a bit. It's not like it's like I type it in and boom, it's the answer and I copy and paste. It's more like it's a starting point and then I can validate it, try out some other things and kind of iteratively approach it.
Yeah. Oh man, that's genius. I hadn't even thought about that. That's a great one. Cool. Okay. Common table expressions, CTEs, see these a lot. Are these purely for humans and readability, or do they actually like make a difference for the optimizer?
I think I'd say that like CTEs, I view them as an alternative to, subqueries or query structure designs that might involve more like left joins or outer joins as opposed to like subquerying. And then like usually sometimes I've done it more as a human where I've like read a complex query with a lot of left joins and a lot of subqueries. And I've taken out an inner part and I've essentially written it as a simple query. and understood its performance characteristics, like whether it needs another index or whatever, or we can structure it. And then you can just kind of wrap it in a CTE, and you can say, with my simple query as SQL. And then you can kind of like take the results from that and feed it to the next query. And sometimes I might not actually end up shipping that, but it helps me understand what the query is doing. And then I could maybe apply the tactics from that simple version to the former query and maybe just more easily identify what it needs to lessen its cost. But yeah, I guess like as far as benefits to the planner, I'm not so familiar with this, but you can materialize CTE results. And I don't think we actually covered that in the book, but from a past presentation, someone mentioned that to me. They're like, hey, do you ever play around with materialize, which is an option in when you create the CTE. And so I also don't want to say that there aren't concrete benefits to the planner as well. I think that there are. I don't know that I have that in my bag of tricks yet, but
yeah. Do you feel like you're fighting the planner very often, or is it not that, like, do you feel like you have to use hints very often, or just like write queries different ways to force the planner more down a different route, or not too much of that?
I mean, not really. Like I know that there's a lot of narrative around that. Like, and if you look at a lot of Stack Overflow posts, or you ask people like, why is the planner doing this, or that sort of thing, like, I don't actually identify with that so much. It's more like, to me, it's like, there has been a occasional really challenging, kind of hard to explain result, but usually it's like, I think of it as there's kind of a deterministic result we can get to, as if we can make a narrow enough selection, which might actually involve changing the queries or pulling in some tricks. Like we might actually add a redundant filter column just so that we could like pick it up on an index and lessen the cost. Or like I might, like recently I just did a trick of like breaking up a query that's just scanning a huge range of data. Like we could get it to a certain point with indexes that was better, but it wasn't dramatic. But by actually rethinking it as what would this look like as a view that would be materialized, that we could add indexes to, I could take that big range and broke it into two queries with materialized views that were indexed, and then union those results together. And it was actually dramatically faster to do that because each individual query was fast. So it's kind of like doing two queries and combining them basically. And yeah, I guess that's generally how I go. It's more like if something's, maybe it's because like if something's not working, I just try to go like a different direction a little bit,
Yep, absolutely. What about, okay, so now we've seen in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years, JSON B columns. I guess, like, how do you think about JSON data? Do you recommend using it? Do you not recommend using it? Yeah, what do you think about there?
Yeah, well, I think if I recommend it in that if like the alternative is, we do 95% of our stuff in Postgres, but we're going to add like MongoDB because we want to do the schemaless thing over here. And now we're running Mongo, or like there's other examples too, but just kind of using Mongo as an example of, we want to store like data that we don't really know the totality of what we want to store. We don't really want to maybe do schema changes all the time to introduce new schema definition. We expect this to be like maybe a high write table. Like I guess in situations where you could stay in Postgres, I think it's worth considering, like, what would this look like as a JSON B column? We can store JSON data and we can index it later. We can access it pretty quickly still. So yeah, I tend to think about it more as like, this is a capability we have in Postgres, but there are some operational trade-offs, like storing larger amounts of text in Postgres. There's this whole toast mechanism that can add latency. It's more kind of like your data is kind of more split up behind the scenes, and those tables, just like other tables, need to be vacuumed and that kind of thing. So depending on the scale and stuff, there can be some significant trade-offs, but it's also really amazing, like the amount of JSON capabilities Postgres has, both for storing and generating JSON. And I also wrote about this in the book. Like, I think JSON doesn't mean, I didn't actually know this when I started writing the book, but like JSON B doesn't mean that you're kind of schemaless or you have no structure that can be supported forever, you can always add that in later with, there's a couple tools like JSON schema validation, I believe. I forgot the name of it now. But what you can do is you can come in later and add a JSON schema compliant schema definition, and then those check constraints we talked about before, and actually add some kind of constraint validation to your data later, which is cool.
Interesting. Yep, that is cool. Okay. One of my favorite posts is from this guy named Nelson L. Hodge. He used to work at Stripe. And he's talking about SQL and relational databases generally, and they're awesome for a lot of things. His biggest concern is like there are so many dang features, and some of them it's hard to know like the operational implications of. And I would say like full text search, aggregations, things like that work well at some scale. And I'm not going to say where that line is, but just like the performance profile changes as you get larger, as compared to like single item lookup on an index value, like going to be pretty consistent as you grow. Like, how do you think about those? Are there features you give like sort of caveats on or avoid or things like that? Or how do you think about that concern?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, another one too would be partition tables, which are like, I kind of like the terminology of like a sharp knife for some of those things, where it's like, if you know what you're doing and you know what the trade-offs are, like you can cut yourself, like with a sharp knife, you don't want to cut yourself, but you also like, you could cut your vegetables much faster because your knife's very sharp. And if you're a skilled operator, now that being said, like I think a lot of people, they do learn from experience. I mean, I do as well. I think like something like, full text search, partition tables, there are capabilities that Postgres supports natively. And that does mean that it does have it has better documentation than it might if it was not natively supported. So like I know in the Postgres documentation, for sure, there are caveats. So I think it's important to, not just willy-nilly adopt advanced features, but to familiarize yourself with the caveats as well, and maybe design in some like observability or metrics that might help you avoid the painful parts so that you can receive the benefits as well. And then I think, like a lot of things with databases is like, try to start small if you can, like a real use, but maybe on a lower criticality area. Maybe like when we're doing the huge index creation, we do that at an off-peak time. Start small and then I think expand. And that's how I've done a lot of like work. Is not only does that limit your kind of blast radius if things do go wrong, but it also, on the other hand, the other way to look at it is it builds your confidence that you can kind of become an operator using these advanced capabilities, and you have real tangible experience to speak to. And then you're just sort of incrementally growing from that, as opposed to going from 0 to 100.
Yeah, absolutely. On that same vein of like, kind of like in the Postgres for everything camp, right? We talked about JSON and full text search and things like that. What do you think about foreign data wrappers?
Yeah, I've used them in a workplace setting for helping us glue like different Postgres databases. I just like checked the time and realized we've been talking for a long time.
No.
I just love talking about Postgres.
Good.
And your questions are great. They're obviously from a place of experience, so you're hitting on the main points. But so foreign data wrappers, like I haven't really used them in a ongoing context, although people do use them that way. But certainly for like, we have this Postgres data, we have a multi-services architecture at the company, and like we have Postgres A over here and Postgres B over here. It's a really cool facility to be like, we can actually treat Postgres B over there in our A database as if it was a local table by connecting to it. But like I've done that more in a one-time sort of thing, like moving some data or going the other direction where we want to split out some data. And then that's one way to look at it. The other way is like, it is a general mechanism where you can have foreign data wrappers for like all kinds of things. It doesn't have to just be a Postgres database. I think the only other one we did in the book was a file, but like treating a file as a read-only table. And I think that can be a really cool component of a solution to kind of tiering your data, where you have old data that you may want to be accessible, but you might want it out of your main Postgres database, but into a file. But I know that there's other companies like Tembo is big on. Tembo's a hosted Postgres provider, and they have these different kind of stacks that they make available. And they've written about some of their foreign data wrappers for external services and technologies.
Yeah. That pattern always it's kind of surprising me because I think one of the big benefits of just use Postgres is, hey, I have one piece of technology. It's operationally sound. I know how it works and things like that. But it's like, hey, if you have a foreign data wrapper, it's like, well, you're routing everything through Postgres, but you still have your Redis or your Elasticsearch or whatever. Sometimes people are piping it through, and it's like you still have to manage that somewhere, So
It's
it's
true.
not like you've really saved a lot there.
Yeah, like if it is, a file is not is is obviously much less concerning operationally than like a whole system, like you said. But yeah, I wouldn't. If someone was going to be doing that, like connecting to Redis or whatever, I would definitely say like, well, you're still going to need observability on that side, access to it. You're going to need to connect to it and check things out from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely. What about sort of on that same vein is like, I feel like there's this giant ecosystem of extensions that are like not quite forks, but they change Postgres like pretty significantly. I'm thinking of like Citus for distributed, or Timescale for time series, or now like Parade DB, who I talked to last week for search and analytics.
Awesome.
Like, yeah, what do you think of that whole ecosystem we're seeing there?
Well, it's cool that Postgres, the extensibility seems to be like energy picking up into, let's really leverage this extensibility. And there's companies that are trying to make, extensions, I think can be as simple as like a function, like a string formatting function, like that could be an extension, but like you said, some folks use the term super extension, where it kind of changes the operational model, or it brings like a whole set of capabilities to core Postgres or community Postgres. And yeah, I mean, I just see it as favorable, as positive. It's like it's broadening the possible usages of Postgres, and that's going to be good for some people. Other people may not use it, but it's a great way to reach some folks that might not otherwise be able to use it. Maybe they run, like the ParadeDB example, like they run Postgres for their main OLTP database. They want to do some full text search. They're comfortable operating Postgres, like they know how to add roles and they know how to size their instances and they kind of know index design. And then it's like, well, what if we used it in this more narrow use case? We run a separate dedicated instance just for full text search. I mean, to me, it's not any more complex than saying like we're going to start with Elasticsearch. Like that's a whole operationally complex beast that has a lot of concepts to learn, like a lot of challenges that can happen once you're in production and you have big indexes and bigger search volume. So, I mean, going into something like, let's take this core Postgres, extend it. If I'm like a engineering leader at a company, like they're kind of in the same realm to me as terms of complexity and that stuff and that sort of thing we're going to take on. And there, you could argue maybe there's less actually on the Postgres path if you're a comfortable operator there. So yeah, I think those things are great. And then like, more extensions ecosystem. Like there's a couple extensions. I can send you a list if you're not aware of these. A couple of like extensions, repositories or websites like that list them and categorize them, and helps give you a peek into like how well maintained they are and what their usage is like, and that sort of thing is a good thing. And then like you may be aware of AWS at reInvent, I think 2 years ago, launched this trusted language extensions capability. And that's another way to get some types of extensions onto cloud providers where you might not otherwise have as much free reign to add extensions that you would if you were self-hosting Postgres. So yeah, I think all that kind of stuff is good. It's like Postgres has these extension points, and like it could make sense to use it in a lot of different ways.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the book. Like, what inspired you to take on this, labor of love to write a 450, 500 page book?
Yeah, well, I guess like I had kind of felt like I reached this staff level engineer level in like a lot of Ruby on Rails at a lot of different companies and a lot of different teams. And, part of it is like I did want to kind of do something, maybe a little more meaningful or impactful, even outside of individual companies I was working for. And I have this like energy around learning these topics and then, like how to make them, I feel like I have the perspective of an application developer and then trying to make them more appealing or accessible to a developer that's probably not going to ever pick up a databases only book, like a Postgres DBA sort of book. So yeah, I just sort of felt like I have this background too, where I also studied the Spanish language in university, had the chance to live in Spain for a while and lived with a family. And there's, I guess like part of my brain is like, I like the idea of bringing two different communities together, like I like meeting people from different cultures and that speak different languages and that sort of thing. And it does sort of feel like two different cultures, like application developers and database administrators or kind of data enthusiasts that, want to like have high quality data, but also like, and then there's this middle ground of like performance enthusiasts, where people like want to make sure that their application can scale well. And they want to understand, why is this API endpoint slow? If it's a database issue, not like a front end browser issue. So yeah, I guess like it was kind of this amalgamation of a lot of different factors of my career spot, and then having this opportunity and having a lot of work I put in to improve our operations, and then feeling like I had something to share.
Yep. How long did it take you to write the book?
Well, it since we know like today it's in print, which is exciting. The official start, I'll have to look back. I think it was April of 2022. So today is in June of 2024. So for sure more than 2 years, 2 to 2.5 years. And in total, I'd say the first draft was about like 9 months, I think, to a year. And then surprisingly, I thought it would be much faster, but that period from when the first draft was done to when actually it went through all the technical editing and then later the layout and that sort of thing and the additional edits, that was actually almost a whole nother year, which is really wild. And I was working full time. I think like for most of it, I think with, a dedicated push, like it could have been much less time. And also as a first time author, like I had a lot of like inefficiencies in my process that I feel like I got more efficient as I went. But it is a very time intensive task, and I couldn't really afford to work on it while not working. And so I'm really, really fortunate to have had like, some supportive managers and then, supportive spouse. And I just feel really happy that I've been able to get it done.
Yep. If you if you could tell yourself back in April 2022, would you like still say go do it? It was like 2 years you're going to invest into it. Did you enjoy the process and that whole thing?
I mean, I think I would because fundamentally I do enjoy the process. Like I write on my blog a lot, and I always have. I'm sure, like you, I have a huge list of things I always want to investigate. And for me, like writing about them is how I do a proper investigation. Like I'll create a little sample and do something a little hands-on. And so I write like a lot of my blog was just sort of unfocused and all over the place, like whatever tech stuff I was looking at, or even just like going to conferences and that sort of thing. But yeah, lately it's felt actually kind of comforting to have more of a special area that I focus within. So I'm trying to really know exactly what's coming, like in the next version of Postgres, what's coming in Ruby on Rails. I'm thinking about things that haven't been covered that well, maybe that are like Postgres capabilities that app developers aren't using, or even within Postgres, like undercovered sort of features and stuff. So the truth is, like, I always want to write and do more. It's just a matter of like trying to balance that with, also like income generating activities, since I haven't really cracked that nut as much. Yeah. And then, just kind of keeping things in balance.
Yep. Any recommendations for folks that are interested in writing a book?
I think that most publishers, if you go the publisher route, of course, they're self-publishing, which I don't really know a lot about. I think I looked in really briefly into, I think it's called Lean Press. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, Lean Press. Yeah.
As one of the options that might help you. But for the publishers, I worked with a couple. They each have a proposal process. So if you've ever worked on like a conference proposal, it's going to be somewhat similar. They'd like you to know, who you're going to market the book to, what kind of ballpark estimates you have for the size of the market, and then you're trying to make a pitch basically that is like, here's why I think this book should exist. Here's some books that are similar but don't quite overlap, and then yeah, be prepared for a very time intensive journey, and it's really fulfilling to. It feels like a privilege. It did for me to like have the purpose to go deep on certain topics and really turn over all the stones. But like it also it needs to be balanced. It comes at a cost of like it takes away time from other activities too, like whether it's working or your family. Like I had to cut out some things temporarily, and then just kind of had the mindset like this will come back eventually. I got to just get through this. So yeah.
Yep, absolutely. I totally agree. That's great. Cool. Let's do some quick fire questions that we always end with here. First of all, if you could master one skill that you don't have right now, what would it be?
Can these be non-technology or?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Anything you want. Yeah.
Yep. I know you asked these from watching past ones, and I even wrote out some answers, but now I'm blanking on all of them.
Yeah.
I started to learn the guitar in COVID and learn like a few chords, and I'm like, this is really fun. It's relaxing. I wish I could play the guitar, but I can't. I can just play a few chords.
Yeah. Cool. That's a good one. What wastes the most time in your day?
Probably myself, just using social media and like not necessarily being disciplined and having a good game plan. And so I think I like to have meetings and structure and goals and that sort of thing. And if I don't, I'm pretty good at wasting time.
Wasting it, yeah. Yeah. Has that been hard in the shift to like independent consulting, like dealing with just some of that time management stuff?
Yeah, I think so. In that, like, it's not actually that I'm just mindlessly browsing. It's more like I do think I'm a creative person in that I always have ideas I want to write about and explore and things, and I can easily just work on a blog post for 3 hours that doesn't go anywhere, but like, and so I think having a purpose, whether it's I'm just actually starting to dabble in paid writing, so stay tuned on that. But if it's writing, like having a purpose, like I'm writing this for my blog, I'm writing this for a third party, or if it's like conference stuff, it's like I'm working on a presentation or whatever. But having some structure, I think I'm getting a little better at trying to even just interrogate myself, like, why am I doing this?
Yeah, exactly. Cool. If you could invest in one company, not a public company, some sort of private company, who would it be?
My wife would not go for me putting a large amount of money in NVIDIA, like not even a long time ago, but even just a few months ago. But like,
really, you wanted to? I kept thinking the whole time, I'm like, no way, it's going to keep going up, and then it's like just gone
so
up and
painful
up
to watch it, like
yeah.
to go just higher and higher and higher, like in that, like I wanted to put money in, but let's see. Well, this is maybe this is a unsurprising answer, but also a little surprising. But yeah, as far as private companies, like I would consider myself friends with the founder, Lucas Fiddle of PG Analyze, and I have no financial stake in the company or anything, but we've caught up at a couple conferences, and we kind of stay in touch pretty regularly through the Postgres community. And I've been now as a consultant using the product with clients, and I really see the value. I think it's a great product. I think it's really cool. Like they've decided to really go deep on Postgres specific observability, the kinds of things that if you're really operating Postgres, like, and you have the real need, like it's got great visibility into things like auto vacuum runs and stuff that other tools might just be like, that's too much in the weeds. We care more about the instance. So I think they're great. And they're a bootstrap company. Lucas has talked about that. I'd love to see them just continue to be more and more successful.
Yeah, cool. That's great to hear. Which person influenced you the most in your career?
Oh man, I know this is a standard question too, and I had a really hard time thinking about a specific person. I guess like there's just been, I've had like engineering managers or senior engineers at companies in my career experience that have been influential. Like one person I've talked about is this guy named Paul Berry, who I'm not sure exactly what he's up to now. I believe he's still a CTO at this startup that he's part of. And but earlier career, like as far as the database stuff, like someone who had really good mastery of writing advanced SQL, like being an operator, being able to go and terminate queries that were out of control and things like that. I'd say people that have those kinds of like hands-on, somebody that's going to be like, oh, let's just hop on a computer and figure this out, like, together. They want to be hands-on but share their knowledge. Like some of the engineering folks in my career, those have been the people that have stuck with me.
Okay, 5 years from now, will people be writing more code or less?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question because the idea is with a lot of code generation tools and AI that you might write less, but it also could create new opportunities with new types of businesses and products and companies that didn't exist before. And I mean, I guess like I just feel like I got to say it's a wash because it's like I could see a little A and a little B.
Yeah, it's true. Yep. All right, I have a special quick fire question for you. As a fellow Timberwolves fan,
oh yes,
should the Timberwolves trade Cat or keep him?
Okay, I can't. This is amazing that you asked me that, by the way, because even amongst my Timberwolves, I grew up in Minnesota. Like I grew up with, like I had a Pooh Richardson, who probably no one knows, like a poster on above my bed, like as a 10-year-old or whatever.
Wow.
And
yeah, that's good.
And I was like in the 2004 Western Conference Finals era of like KG and that sort of team. Like, so I've been a long time I did take a long break because we moved away from Minnesota, but I've been back since.
That's a good time to take a break because
I'm like the worst. But we moved back actually to Minnesota in 2015, which is Cat's rookie year, and hopefully he never watches this podcast because I do sort of feel like it might be good to trade Cat. I think with the structure of the team now, like he's an extremely valuable offensive player that will also be extremely valuable to another team. I just think that like possibly for the composition of the team, because NBA is all about like matchups and like he does generate a lot of offense, so we would need a lot of offense to replace his generation. But I just think that like it might be a good time to make a change. He's been with the team for I believe 8 years, and
yeah. I know. I go back and forth. Even in the playoffs, like he'll have those crazy frustrating games. I'm like, oh my gosh, just
he'll have a 60-point game, and then he'll have like a 10-point game, and it's
and 6 fouls and like of the dumbest fouls you've ever seen. And
but yeah, he seems like an amazing person, and he's had a lot of tough breaks in his personal life and stuff. And and he's been a huge Minnesota advocate for being a relatively smaller city and that within the NBA, within the country and stuff. And that's great. But I'm slightly on the like let's explore the right trade camp, which is controversial even amongst local Timberwolves fans. So it's really funny you asked. Yeah,
it's tough. Yeah. So, Andrew, it's been great to have you on. Tell us a little bit more about the book, where we can find it, where people can find you, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so High Performance Postgres for Rails. It's available from all the major places, Amazon and whatnot. The publisher is Pragmatic Bookshelf, and so their website is pragmaticprogrammers.com, where you can buy the book as well. It's also on Bookshop, which is like a more of an independent bookseller. And I blog at andyatkinson.com. And then these days I mostly use Twitter/X, but I have social media accounts in most places, but I mostly tend to hang out there and post about Postgres and Rails things and conferences and stuff like that.
Yep. Cool. Well, as I said, like totally recommend the book, even if you've never written any Rails. I'd say if you're in that application DBA or accidental DBA camp of just like, hey, you want to ship some features, but you also want to understand what's happening under the hood, I think it's really, really good for that. So
really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. We'll have a link in the show notes and all that stuff. And Andrew, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.